20 years after a single night with a woman, a billionaire is saved by a doctor who bears his mark. Could she be his daughter? My beautiful family, this will be one of the most unforgettable stories I've ever told. If you are here for the very first time, trust me just once. I promise to satisfy your heart with a story that will touch your soul. But if you still decide to leave, I will not hold you back. I will only say, may God bless you. My beloved family, today holds deep meaning for me. It is my and Binta's 32nd engagement anniversary. For more than 3 decades, she has been my strength, my blessing, and my greatest gift from God. I share this with you because you are not just listeners, you are my family, and every celebration in my life belongs to all of us together. Let's start the most beautiful story together. Some nights change everything, and some storms bring more than just rain. They bring reckoning. The mountain cabin stood like a fortress against the fury of nature, its windows blazing with warm light as the storm raged across the Montana peaks. Inside, 19-year-old Kira Ashanti sat cross-legged before the fireplace, her medical textbooks spread around her like fallen soldiers. The pages of Gray's Anatomy flickered in the firelight. Each diagram and description burned into her memory with the intensity of her ambition. She had come to this remote place for solitude, to prepare for her final year of pre-med without the distractions of campus life. Her professors had warned her about the isolation, but Kira thrived in silence. It was in quietude that she found her strength. In solitude that she discovered the depths of her own brilliance. The storm had been building for hours, turning the mountain roads treacherous and the night air electric with anticipation. Thunder rolled across the valleys like the voice of an angry god, and lightning painted the peaks in stark silver relief. Kira had seen storms before, but nothing like this, nothing that seemed to carry the weight of destiny in its winds. Then came the headlights. They swept across her windows like searching fingers, cutting through the rain and darkness with desperate intensity. Kira looked up from her books, her heart suddenly racing with an inexplicable premonition. The light stopped, and through the rain she could see a figure stumbling toward her door, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the determined grace of a man accustomed to conquering obstacles. The knock came like thunder itself, urgent, demanding, impossible to ignore. Kira rose and moved to the door, her hand hesitating on the heavy wooden latch. In that moment, she felt as though she stood at the edge of a cliff, as though opening this door would mean stepping into empty air with no certainty of landing safely. "Please," came a voice from the other side, deep and rough with desperation. "My car died. I need shelter." She opened the door. He stood there like a force of nature himself, 25 years old, water streaming from his expensive suit, his dark hair plastered to his skull by the rain. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath, grey as storm clouds, intense as lightning, holding a power that seemed to reach into her chest and squeeze her heart. "I'm Atlas," he said, "and even soaked to the bone, even desperate and stranded." His voice carried the confidence of a man who had never been denied anything he truly wanted. "Kira," she replied, stepping back to let him enter. As he crossed her threshold, she felt something shift in the universe, as though the storm outside had somehow moved inside her chest. Atlas Meridian, though she wouldn't learn his last name until much later, filled her small cabin with his presence. He was everything her professors had warned her about in their lectures on focus and dedication. He was distraction personified, temptation wrapped in a storm-soaked suit, danger disguised as salvation. She brought him towels and watched as he dried his hair, noting the way his movements spoke of wealth and privilege. His suit, even wrinkled and damp, was worth more than her textbooks. His watch caught the firelight like captured stars. He was from a world she had only seen in magazines, a realm of power and influence that seemed as distant as the moon. "You're studying medicine," he observed, nodding toward her books scattered across the floor. "Pre-med," she corrected, settling back down among her texts. "Final year." He moved closer to the fire, and she caught his scent. expensive cologne mixed with rain and something indefinably masculine that made her pulse quicken. Ambitious. Necessary, she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. I'm going to be a doctor. Something in her tone made him pause. It wasn't a dream she was sharing, not a hope or a wish. It was a declaration, a promise made to herself and the universe. Atlas had heard many people speak of their ambitions, but never with such quiet certainty, such unshakable conviction. What kind of doctor? He asked, settling into the chair across from her. The kind that saves lives, Kira said simply. The kind that makes a difference. They talked through the night as the storm raged outside. He told her about his business, some technology venture that was poised to explode into success. She told him about her studies, about the mountain clinic where she volunteered, about her dreams of bringing modern medicine to underserved communities. He spoke of conquering markets. She spoke of healing people. He dreamed of wealth. She dreamed of purpose. And yet, despite the vast differences in their worlds, something sparked between them in that firelit cabin. Perhaps it was the isolation, the sense of being suspended outside normal time and space. Perhaps it was the storm itself, creating a pocket of intimacy in the vast wilderness. Or perhaps it was simply the inexplicable alchemy that sometimes occurs when two souls recognize something essential in each other. As dawn approached, the conversation grew softer, more personal. Atlas found himself telling this 19-year-old woman things he had never shared with anyone. His fears about success, his uncertainty about the path he had chosen, his surprising loneliness despite his growing wealth and influence. Kira, in turn, shared her struggles, the financial pressures, the discrimination she faced as a young black woman in a predominantly white field, the weight of carrying her family's hopes and dreams on her shoulders. "You're extraordinary," Atlas said, as the first light began to creep through the windows. He had moved from his chair to sit beside her on the floor, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I'm determined," she corrected, but her voice was softer now, affected by his proximity and the intensity of his gaze. "Same thing," he murmured, reaching out to trace the line of her cheek with gentle fingers. When he kissed her, it felt like coming home and stepping into fire simultaneously. The attraction that had been building between them all night exploded into something fierce and undeniable. They made love as the storm reached its crescendo outside, their bodies moving together with a passion that seemed to match the fury of wind and rain. For 3 days, the storm held them captive in that cabin. 3 days of conversation and laughter, of heated debates and tender silences. 3 days of exploring each other's minds and bodies with equal intensity. Atlas discovered that Kira was not just beautiful, but brilliant, not just passionate, but principled. She challenged him intellectually, inspired him spiritually, and awakened desires he hadn't known he possessed. Kira found herself falling for a man who seemed to see past her youth to the woman she was becoming, who listened to her dreams as though they mattered, who made her feel powerful and precious simultaneously. On the morning of the 4th day, the storm finally broke. Sunlight streamed through the windows, painting everything golden. Atlas's car miraculously started on the first try. The electrical system had simply needed time to dry out. As he prepared to leave, he pulled a business card from his wallet and pressed it into Kira's palm. "I have to go back to New York," he said, his hands cupping her face. "There's a deal I've been working on for months, but I'll come back for you. 2 weeks, maybe 3 at the most." Kira looked into his storm-grey eyes and saw sincerity there, saw what she believed was love. "Promise me." "I promise you everything," Atlas said, kissing her with desperate intensity. "I promise you forever." She believed him. Standing in that cabin doorway, watching his car disappear down the mountain road, 19-year-old Kira Ashanti believed that love conquered all, that promises made in passion were unbreakable, that the man who had just driven away would return to claim her, heart and build a life with her. She touched her lips where his kiss still lingered and felt the future stretching. out before them like a golden road. "Forever," she whispered to the morning air, never imagining that some promises are meant to be broken, and some storms leave devastation in their wake that takes decades to repair. Chapter 2. The Lie That Built an Empire. The cruelest lies are the ones we tell ourselves when we're running from the truth. Atlas. Meridian caught the first commercial flight out of Montana. The cramped airline seat a stark contrast to the comfortable cabin where he had spent 3 perfect days. The business class ticket stretched his budget, but he needed to get back to New York immediately. The Hartwell Industries acquisition couldn't wait, and every hour of delay could cost him the deal that would transform his promising startup into a major player. 3 days ago, he had been focused solely on the Hartwell Industries acquisition, a deal that would catapult his tech company from promising startup to major player in the industry. Now, staring down at the city sprawling below the airplane window, all he could think about was storm-grey eyes and a woman whose passion burned brighter than any ambition he had ever harbored. The merger meetings began the moment his feet touched the tarmac. Conference rooms filled with lawyers and executives, documents requiring his signature, decisions demanding his immediate attention. The corporate world that had always energized him now felt suffocating, artificial, hollow compared to the raw authenticity of those 3 days in the cabin. He tried calling Kira twice in the first week, but the mountain cabin had no cell service, and the landline went straight to voicemail. Her voice on the recording was professional, distant, nothing like the intimate warmth he remembered. He left messages promising to return soon, but even as he spoke the words, he could feel them becoming less solid, less real. The Hartwell deal was more complex than anyone had anticipated. What should have been a 2-week negotiation stretched into a month, then 2. Atlas found himself working 18-hour days, sleeping in his office, living on coffee, and the intoxicating rush of closing his first major acquisition. The deal wasn't just about money anymore. It was about proving himself capable of competing with established companies, about earning credibility in an industry dominated by older, more experienced players. His assistant fielded calls from Montana, a woman asking for Mr. Meridian, her voice urgent at first, then defeated. Atlas told himself he would call back when the deal closed, when he had time to think clearly, when he could give Kira the attention she deserved. But deep down, in the part of his soul he refused to examine, he was already building walls against the vulnerability she had awakened in him. Success had a way of rewriting memory. With each passing month, as his company grew and his bank account expanded, the cabin began to feel like something that had happened to someone else. The passion he had felt for Kira, so overwhelming in the moment, now seemed like an aberration, a temporary distraction brought on by isolation and unusual circumstances. He told himself that what they had shared was just a beautiful interlude, a perfect storm of attraction and circumstance that could never survive in the harsh light of the real world. She was 19 and idealistic, just starting her life. He was building an empire. They wanted different things, lived in different universes. It would have never worked. The lies came easier each time he told them. By the end of his first year back in New York, Atlas had convinced himself that he had done Kira a favor by staying away. She was brilliant and determined. She didn't need him complicating her life with his uncertain business ventures and demanding work schedule. She deserved someone who could give her the simple, steady love that her goodness merited. Not a man whose future was still tied up in unpredictable startup ventures. The business card he had given her became a symbol of his transformation. He had it removed from circulation, claiming it was outdated. In reality, he couldn't bear the thought of her trying to reach him through that number. Couldn't face the conversation that would force him to admit what he was becoming. A man who had chosen wealth over love, or power over passion. Atlas threw himself into his work with religious fervor. He closed the Hartwell deal, then pursued 2 more acquisitions in rapid succession, gradually building his company's reputation and market presence. His net worth climbed from thousands to hundreds of thousands to his first million. Local business publications began to take notice. Regional investors sought meetings. Women began to notice his growing success and confidence. He dated models and socialites, actresses and entrepreneurs. Beautiful women who understood the rules of his world, who knew that relationships were transactions and love was a luxury successful men couldn't afford. He was careful never to let anyone get too close, never to repeat the mistake of vulnerability he had made in that Montana cabin. The years blurred together in a haze of deals and acquisitions, mergers and hostile takeovers. Atlas Meridian became a name whispered with equal parts admiration and fear in boardrooms across America. He was ruthless in business, charming in society, and utterly empty in the quiet moments when he was alone with his thoughts. He married twice, brief unions with women who were as ambitious and emotionally guarded as he had become. Both marriages ended in civilized divorces, with prenups that protected his assets and non-disclosure agreements that protected his privacy. There were no children, no messy emotional entanglements, no complications that might interfere with his relentless pursuit of success. By his 40th birthday, Atlas was worth nearly $1 billion. He owned homes on 3 continents, had politicians on his payroll, and commanded respect in every room he entered. He should have felt victorious, should have felt the deep satisfaction of a man who had achieved everything he had ever wanted. Instead, he felt nothing at all. The emptiness crept up on him gradually, like a slow-acting poison in his bloodstream. At first, he attributed it to stress, to the natural ebb and flow of motivation that came with high-pressure careers. He threw himself into new ventures, started a foundation, dabbled in politics. But nothing filled the void that seemed to expand with each passing year. He began having dreams about storms and mountain cabins, about a woman with fire in her eyes and healing in her hands. He would wake from these dreams, feeling more exhausted than when he had gone to sleep. Haunted by a loss, he refused to acknowledge even to himself. His doctor prescribed sleeping pills. His therapist suggested vacation. His friends recommended new women to distract him. But Atlas knew that what ailed him couldn't be cured by conventional remedies. He had built his empire on a foundation of sand, the abandoned promise of authentic connection, the discarded possibility of genuine love. In his rare moments of complete honesty, usually late at night when the pills hadn't worked and the city lay sleeping below his penthouse windows, Atlas wondered what had become of Kira Ashanti. Had she finished medical school? Had she become the doctor she had dreamed of being? Had she found someone worthy of her brilliance? Someone who could appreciate the rare gift of her passion? He hired investigators twice, then called them off both times before they could complete their reports. He told himself it was respect for her privacy, but he knew the truth. He was afraid of what he might learn, afraid that she had moved on completely while he remained trapped in the amber of his own choosing. The years continued to pass. Atlas grew richer, more powerful, more isolated. He surrounded himself with lawyers and advisors, sycophants and competitors, but never again with anyone who could see past his success to the man beneath. He had learned to mistake fear for wisdom, isolation for strength. At 45, Atlas Meridian was one of the most successful men in America. He was also one of the loneliest. The storm that had brought him to Kira's cabin had passed long ago, but he was still running from its aftermath, still fleeing from the truth that some shelters are too precious to abandon, and some promises are too sacred to break. In his dreams, he still heard her voice asking him to promise her everything, still felt the weight of the words he had spoken with such certainty, "I promise you forever." But forever, he whispered to his empty penthouse, was a lie I told us both. Chapter 3. The woman who refused to break. Strength isn't born in comfort, it's forged in the fire of impossible choices and unwavering determination. The pregnancy test stared back at Kira Ashanti with two pink lines that changed everything. Her hands trembled as she set it on the bathroom counter of her tiny apartment near the university. The plastic stick holding more power than any weapon, more consequence than any decision she had ever made. 2 months had passed since Atlas disappeared down the mountain road with promises of return. 2 months of waiting for phone calls that never came, of checking her voicemail with desperate hope that gradually curdled into bitter understanding. The business card he had given her led to disconnected numbers and corporate voicemails that swallowed her messages like stones thrown into a deep well. 19 years old, 3 months pregnant, and utterly alone, Kira sank onto her narrow bed and pressed her hands to her still flat stomach. Inside her, Atlas's child grew with each passing day, a living reminder of 3 perfect days that had apparently meant nothing to the father. The irony wasn't lost on her. She who had dedicated her life to healing was now carrying life created with a man who had vanished like smoke. The choices before her were stark and unforgiving. She could terminate the pregnancy and continue her studies unimpeded, pursuing the medical career she had dreamed of since childhood. She could carry the baby to term and give it up for adoption, allowing some other family to raise Atlas's child while she rebuilt her shattered plans. Or she could keep the baby and find a way to be both mother and medical student. Though everyone from her professors to her family insisted such a path led only to failure. Kira chose the impossible path. "I will not sacrifice my dreams," she whispered to her reflection in the bathroom mirror, "and I will not sacrifice my child. I will find a way to have both." The reaction from those around her was swift and predictable. Her academic advisor, Dr. Harrison, called her into his office within a week of her announcement. The elderly professor sat behind his massive oak desk like a judge delivering a sentence. His expression a mixture of disappointment and condescension. "Miss Ashanti," he said, removing his wire-rimmed glasses to polish them with deliberate slowness, "you're one of our most promising students. Your grades are exemplary, your dedication unquestionable. Don't throw it all away for some romantic foolishness." "This isn't romantic foolishness," Kira replied, her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest. "This is my child and this is my life. I intend to finish my degree." Dr. Harrison leaned back in his leather chair, his smile patronizing. "My dear girl, medical school is demanding enough for students without divided attention. Single motherhood is a full-time job. You simply cannot do both effectively." "Watch me," Kira said, standing from her chair with the grace of a queen rising from her throne. She walked out of his office with her spine straight and her head high, but once she reached the hallway, the tears came like a flood. Not tears of defeat, but tears of rage. Rage at a system that demanded women choose between motherhood and ambition. Rage at a world that punished her for the sins of a man who had vanished without consequence. Rage at the unfairness of carrying this burden alone. But rage, Kira discovered, could be fuel if properly channeled. She threw herself into her studies with frightening intensity, as though academic excellence could armor her against the whispers that followed her across campus. She worked in the university library until it closed, then continued studying in her apartment by the light of cheap desk lamps. Her pregnancy progressed, and still she maintained her perfect GPA. Still she excelled in every course. Still she proved wrong every professor who had suggested she step aside. The whispers grew louder as her belly grew rounder. Fellow students speculated about the father's identity, spinning elaborate theories that ranged from scandalous to absurd. Some assumed he was a professor, others guessed he was married, most simply concluded he was a coward who had abandoned his responsibilities. Kira endured their speculation with stoic silence, refusing to give them the satisfaction of her pain or her secrets. Financial pressure mounted alongside academic stress. Her part-time job at the campus bookstore barely covered rent and groceries, let alone the mounting medical bills. Pride prevented her from asking her family for help. They had sacrificed enough to get her this far, and she refused to burden them further with consequences that were hers alone to bear. She sold her textbooks at the end of each semester and bought used ones for the next, studied from library copies when she couldn't afford to purchase required readings, lived on rice and beans when money ran short. Every sacrifice felt like a small victory, proof that she could survive anything life threw at her. The baby kicked for the first time during her organic chemistry final. Kira pressed her hand to her stomach, feeling the flutter of tiny limbs, and smiled, despite the stress hormones coursing through her system. This child would be born to a mother who never gave up, who never compromised her dreams, who turned obstacles into stepping stones. Labor came 2 weeks early, in the middle of final examinations. Kira drove herself to the hospital between contractions, completed her medical ethics exam in the maternity ward waiting room, and gave birth to her daughter 12 hours later, with no one but the medical staff for support. The moment the doctor placed that tiny, perfect baby on her chest, Kira understood why she had fought so hard. This wasn't just her daughter, this was her motivation made flesh, her future given form, her strength transformed into something she could hold and protect and love unconditionally. "Lyra," she whispered, naming her daughter for the constellation that had been visible through the cabin window on the night she was conceived. "My beautiful girl, you are going to change the world." Lyra Ashanti entered the world with her mother's determined cry and her father's storm-grey eyes, though Kira chose to see only her own reflection in that perfect face. She finished her undergraduate degree while pregnant, graduating summa cum laude with a perfect GPA and a newborn daughter who slept through the graduation ceremony. The transition to medical school with an infant was brutal beyond description. Sleepless nights of studying while nursing, attending lectures with diaper bags hidden under her desk, finding childcare among other struggling students who accepted payment in home-cooked meals, and tutoring sessions when money was too tight for actual payment. Medical school acceptances arrived like validation from the universe. Harvard, Johns Hopkins, Stanford, all the prestigious institutions that Dr. Harrison had insisted were beyond her reach with a child in tow. She chose a state school closer to home, partly for financial reasons and partly because she wanted Lyra to grow up knowing her extended family. The pattern repeated in medical school: whispered doubts, raised eyebrows, condescending advice from professors who assumed single motherhood had compromised her potential. And once again, Kira proved them wrong with grades that placed her at the top of her class and clinical rotations that earned her recognition as one of the most promising doctors in her program. Lyra grew up in hospital cafeterias and medical libraries, coloring in anatomy textbooks while her mother memorized drug interactions. She learned to be quiet during study sessions and proud during graduation ceremonies. She understood from an early age that her mother was special, that women like Kira Ashanti didn't come along very often. "Mama," 5-year-old Lyra asked one night as Kira tucked her into bed, "why don't I have a daddy like the other kids?" Kira's hand stilled on her daughter's forehead, her heart clenching with familiar pain. She had dreaded this question, known it would come eventually, but she still wasn't prepared for the innocent curiosity in those grey eyes, eyes that were her only inheritance from a father who would never know her. "Because," Kira said finally, her voice steady with hard-won wisdom, "queens don't need kings to build kingdoms. And you, my darling girl, are definitely royalty." Lyra accepted this explanation with the easy faith of childhood, but Kira knew that harder questions would come. Someday her daughter would want specifics, would demand the truth about the man whose DNA she carried, but whose name she didn't know. When that day came, Kira would tell her about the storm and the cabin, about promises broken and dreams deferred. But she would also tell her about the strength that emerged from abandonment, about the power that came from refusing to be defined by someone else's weaknesses. Medical school graduation arrived like dawn after the longest night. Dr. Kira Ashanti walked across that stage with her chin high and her daughter cheering from the audience. Proof that some obstacles were meant to be conquered rather than avoided. She chose family medicine as her specialty, drawn to the idea of healing whole communities rather than specializing in narrow fields. Her residency took her back to Montana, full circle to the mountains where her journey had begun, though now she returned as a doctor rather than a student, as a mother rather than a naive girl who believed in forever. The mountain town embraced Dr. Ashanti and her brilliant daughter with warmth that bordered on reverence. Here was a woman who had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious, who had transformed the consequences of someone else's betrayal into a testament to her own unbreakable spirit. Some women, the town elder said at a community dinner honoring Kira's return, bend under pressure. Others use it to forge steel. Dr. Ashanti is made of the finest steel I've ever seen. Kira smiled at the compliment, but privately she knew the truth was more complex. She hadn't been born strong. Strength had been beaten into her by circumstance, hammered into shape by necessity, tempered by the fire of raising a child alone while pursuing the most demanding career imaginable. She was 38 years old now, at the peak of her professional powers and the height of her personal confidence. The girl who had waited by the phone for Atlas's calls was long dead, replaced by a woman who had learned that the only promises worth keeping were the ones you made to yourself. The strongest steel, she whispered to her reflection that night, remembering the elder's words, is forged in the hottest fire, and I have been burning for 20 years. Chapter 4. The Daughter Who Inherited Fire. Legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's what you build while others watch and learn to become flames themselves. At 19, Lyra Ashanti possessed her mother's fierce intelligence wrapped in her father's natural charisma, though she knew nothing of the latter inheritance. She moved through the halls of Stanford University's medical school like a force of nature barely contained. One of the youngest fourth-year medical students in the program's history, her storm-grey eyes holding the same intensity that had once made a billionaire forget his own name in a mountain cabin. Unlike her mother's journey through medical education, Lyra's path was paved with full scholarships and academic accolades. She had graduated high school as valedictorian at 14, completed her undergraduate degree in 2 years, and entered medical school at 16 as the youngest student ever accepted. Where Kira had fought for every opportunity, Lyra seemed to attract success with effortless magnetism. But those closest to her knew that nothing about Lyra Ashanti was effortless. She studied with the same relentless determination that had carried her mother through single parenthood and medical school. She pushed herself past exhaustion, past reasonable limits, past the point where most students would surrender to burnout. She was driven by something deeper than ambition, a need to prove herself worthy of the sacrifices her mother had made, worthy of the strength that had forged their unconventional family from the wreckage of abandoned promises. Excellence isn't optional in this family. Lyra often told her study partners, her voice carrying an edge that made them understand this wasn't arrogance, but acknowledgement of a standard that had been set long before she was born. She was beautiful in a way that combined her mother's elegant bone structure with something indefinably compelling that drew people into her orbit. Her skin held the warm brown tones of her maternal heritage, but her eyes were pure, storm cloud grey, an unusual colouring that made strangers take a second look and wonder about her story. The only physical reminder of her unknown paternity was the crescent-shaped birthmark on her neck, a pale silver mark that her mother sometimes traced with absent fingers during quiet moments. Lyra had asked about it countless times throughout her childhood, but Kira's explanations were always vague. A birthmark, nothing more, proof that she was special. marked by the universe for greatness. As Lyra grew older, she began to suspect there was more to the story. The mark was too distinct, too unusual to be random. Sometimes she caught her mother staring at it with an expression of mingled pain and longing that suggested deeper significance. But Kira Ashanti was a master of protective silence, and Lyra had learned not to push when her mother's walls went up. The truth about her father was a constant undercurrent in Lyra's life, not quite an obsession, but a persistent curiosity that colored her understanding of herself and her place in the world. She knew he had been someone her mother had loved and trusted, someone who had disappeared when responsibility called. Beyond that, Kira offered only the basic facts. He was white. He was educated. He was a coward who didn't deserve to know the extraordinary woman his daughter had become. "He's a ghost," Lyra told her roommate during one of their late-night conversations. "A shadow that helped make me but has no substance, no reality. My mother is the only parent I need." But even as she said the words, Lyra felt the hollow space where half her identity should have been. She was proud of her mother's accomplishments, fiercely protective of the sacrifices Kira had made, but part of her wondered what traits she might have inherited from the man who had helped create her. Did she have his laugh, his analytical mind, his capacity for cruelty? At Stanford, Lyra distinguished herself not just academically, but as a leader among her peers. She founded a mentoring program for first-generation college students, volunteered at free clinics in underserved communities, and somehow found time to conduct research that was already attracting attention from major medical journals. Her professors spoke of her with the kind of reverence usually reserved for once-in-a-generation talents. "Miss Ashanti," Dr. Morrison said after her presentation on innovative cardiac surgery techniques, "your insights are remarkable for someone at your level. Have you considered accelerating your timeline? You could be practicing medicine by 22, leading research by 25. Lyra accepted the praise with grace, but privately, she felt the weight of expectation that had followed her throughout her academic career. Being Kira Ashanti's daughter meant that ordinary excellence wasn't sufficient. She had to be extraordinary, had to justify the faith placed in her, had to honor the struggles that had brought her to this moment. The summer before her final year of medical school, Lyra returned to Montana to work alongside her mother at the mountain clinic. It was a pilgrimage of sorts, a chance to reconnect with the community that had supported them both, to remember where she came from before launching into the next phase of her journey. The clinic had expanded significantly since Kira's return to Montana. What had once been a small facility serving the immediate area now drew patients from 3 counties, all seeking the expertise of Dr. Kira Ashanti and her growing team of medical professionals. Kira had built something lasting, something that would continue healing long after she was gone. "This is your legacy too," Kira told her daughter as they walked through the clinic together. "All of this exists because I refuse to let one man's weakness define our future. Someday, you'll build something even greater." Lyra watched her mother interact with patients and staff, noting the respect that bordered on reverence in their voices when they spoke to Dr. Ashanti. Here was a woman who had transformed personal devastation into community service, who had turned the pain of abandonment into a career dedicated to healing others. "I want to be like you," Lyra said that evening as they sat on the porch of their small house, watching the sun set behind the mountains where her story had begun. "No," Kira replied, her voice gentle but firm. "You need to be better than me. You need to take everything I've given you and build something I never could have imagined. That's how legacy works. Each generation reaches higher than the last." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell across the valley. Lyra felt the weight of her mother's expectations, but also the strength of her foundation. She was Kira Ashanti's daughter, raised by a woman who had refused to break under impossible pressure, shaped by an example of resilience that few people ever witnessed. What do you think he's doing now? Lyra asked quietly, breaking the peaceful silence. My father. Kira's hand stilled on her coffee cup, and for a moment Lyra saw something flicker in her mother's eyes. Pain, longing, carefully controlled rage. I think he's living with the consequences of his choices, Kira said finally. Just as we all are. Do you ever wonder if he thinks about us? The question hung in the evening air like smoke from a dying fire. Kira was quiet for so long that Lyra thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried 20 years of hard-won wisdom and carefully guarded hurt. I used to wonder, Kira admitted. I used to imagine scenarios where he would return, where he would have some explanation that made sense of his disappearance. But wondering is a luxury I couldn't afford when I had a daughter to raise and a career to build. Lyra nodded, understanding the practical wisdom behind her mother's pragmatism. But she also heard what her mother didn't say, that the wondering hadn't stopped entirely, that somewhere in the deepest part of Kira's heart, questions still lingered about the man who had promised forever and delivered nothing but silence. I think about meeting him sometimes, Lyra confessed. Not for reunion or reconciliation, but for answers. I want to look him in the eye and understand what kind of man abandons his child without a backward glance. And what would you do if you ever found him? Kira asked, her voice carefully neutral. Lyra smiled, and in that expression her mother saw the steel that had been forged through 19 years of being raised by a woman who refused to accept defeat. I'd thank him, Lyra said, for being exactly the kind of father he was, absent, because his weakness gave me the strongest mother in the world. As they headed inside for the night, Lyra caught her reflection in the hallway mirror and paused. The crescent-shaped birthmark on her neck seemed to catch the light differently in the mountain air, more prominent than usual, almost glowing against her skin. She reached up to touch it, as she had countless times throughout her life, and felt the familiar curiosity about its significance. Somewhere out there was a man who might have a similar mark, who might see himself reflected in her grey eyes, who might recognize the stubborn set of her jaw as his own. But that man was a stranger to her, while the woman upstairs, preparing for another day of healing, was everything she aspired to become. Thank you, Lyra whispered to her reflection, addressing the ghost father who would never hear her words. Thank you for being weak enough to leave, and for leaving me with someone strong enough to stay. The mark seemed to pulse with life under her fingertips, a connection to a past she would never fully understand, and a future that remained unwritten. Tomorrow I save my first life, she told herself, preparing for another day of clinical rotations in her journey toward becoming a doctor. And I do it for her, not for him. Chapter 5. The Billionaire's Empty Victory. Success without meaning is the cruelest prison of all, golden bars that keep the soul locked away from everything that matters. Atlas Meridian stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan penthouse, 45 stories above the city that had made him one of the richest men in America. The lights of New York spread out below him like fallen stars, each point of illumination representing lives he would never touch, dreams he would never understand, connections he would never make. At 45, he possessed everything a man was supposed to want, and felt nothing but the hollow ache of a life built on the wrong foundation. Forbes had just named him to their list of the world's wealthiest individuals, his net worth cresting $8 billion through a combination of technological innovation, strategic acquisitions, and the kind of ruthless business acumen that made competitors respect and fear him in equal measure. His latest venture, a revolutionary data analytics platform, had just been acquired by a tech giant for a sum that would make him richer than small nations. The penthouse around him was a monument to success, filled with art worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime, furnished with pieces that had graced palaces and museums. Every surface spoke of wealth and taste, every corner designed to impress and intimidate. Yet as Atlas gazed out at the city below, he felt like a stranger in his own life, a visitor to someone else's achievements. His phone buzzed with congratulations from business associates, politicians and social climbers who wanted to bask in the reflected glow of his triumph. The messages blurred together, empty praise from people who knew his net worth better than they knew his name, who valued his influence more than they would ever value him as a human being. "Mr. Meridian," his personal assistant's voice came through the intercom. "The interview with Business Week has been confirmed for tomorrow at 10. The photographer from Fortune will arrive at 2. And your therapist would like to reschedule your appointment to Thursday." Atlas nodded absently, though she couldn't see him through the glass and steel that separated his private space from the rest of the world. Dr. Sandra Chen had been trying to schedule regular sessions for 3 months, ever since his personal physician had suggested that Atlas's chronic insomnia and increasing isolation might benefit from professional intervention. Success depression, Dr. Chen had called it during their first meeting. "It's more common than you might think among high achievers. You've spent so long pursuing goals that once you achieve them, you discover they weren't the right goals at all." Atlas had dismissed the diagnosis initially, attributing his malaise to stress and the natural ebb and flow of motivation that came with high-stakes business ventures. But as the months passed and his empire continued to grow while his satisfaction diminished, he began to wonder if Dr. Chen might be onto something deeper than he was comfortable acknowledging. The irony wasn't lost on him. He who had built a fortune by analyzing human behavior through data patterns couldn't understand the most basic algorithms of his own emotional life. He could predict market movements with startling accuracy, but remained mystified by the persistent emptiness that had settled in his chest like a stone. His third marriage had ended 6 months ago, another casualized dissolution that made headlines in the business press for exactly 1 news cycle before being forgotten. Christina had been perfect on paper, beautiful, accomplished, socially connected, and blessed with the kind of emotional detachment that made her an ideal partner for someone who prioritized work above all else. "You're not present," she had said during their final conversation, her voice holding the weary disappointment of someone who had expected little and received even less. "Even when you're here physically, you're somewhere else entirely. I feel like I'm married to a ghost." Atlas had signed the divorce papers without argument, added another settlement to his list of expenses, and felt nothing but relief that the pretense was finally over. Christina deserved someone who could love her properly, someone whose heart wasn't locked away behind fortifications built from ambition and fear. The pattern had repeated itself through all his relationships: initial attraction, carefully negotiated emotional boundaries, gradual mutual withdrawal, and inevitable dissolution. He attracted women who were drawn to power and wealth, but none who could reach past his defenses to find whatever remained of his authentic self. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, 30-year-old, Macallan that cost more than most people's monthly salaries, and settled into his leather chair. The same chair where he had conducted hostile takeovers and million-dollar negotiations. Now it felt like a throne in an empty kingdom, a symbol of power that ruled over nothing but loneliness. The dreams had been coming more frequently lately, vivid, nocturnal journeys to places he didn't consciously remember. Mountain cabins and storm-lashed windows, firelight and rain, the sensation of touching something precious and fragile and infinite. He would wake from these dreams feeling more exhausted than when he had gone to sleep, haunted by the ghost of emotions he couldn't quite grasp upon waking. Dr. Chen had suggested that the dreams might be his subconscious, trying to process unresolved experiences from his past, but Atlas had deflected the conversation with practiced ease. He didn't believe in the kind of psychological archaeology that therapy demanded. didn't trust the process of digging through layers of memory to uncover whatever might be buried there. Yet the dreams persisted, growing stronger and more detailed with each passing month. In them, he was younger, less guarded, capable of feeling things with an intensity that his waking self had forgotten how to access. There was always a woman in these dreams, her face frustratingly unclear, but her presence undeniably powerful, as though she held the key to some essential part of himself that he had lost along the way to success. His personal physician, Dr. Marcus Webb, had been monitoring Atlas's declining physical health with growing concern. The insomnia had led to chronic fatigue, which had led to increased reliance on stimulants, which had led to elevated blood pressure and irregular heart rhythms that concerned everyone except Atlas himself. "Your body is trying to tell you something," Dr. Webb had warned during their last appointment. "Stress is literally killing you, Atlas. All the money in the world won't matter if you're dead before 50. But Atlas couldn't see a way out of the cycle that had become his life. His companies required constant attention. His investments demanded strategic oversight. His reputation needed careful management. He was trapped by his own success, imprisoned by responsibilities that felt increasingly meaningless, yet impossible to abandon. The business world saw him as a visionary, a master of digital transformation who had revolutionized how companies understood and utilized data. What they couldn't see was the man behind the reputation, someone who had become so skilled at analyzing other people's patterns that he had lost touch with his own desires, someone who could predict mass behavior while remaining a mystery to himself. He owned homes in New York, Los Angeles, London, and Monaco, but none of them felt like home. They were showplaces, stages for the performance of wealth, designed to impress rather than comfort. He could travel anywhere in the world on a moment's notice, but had nowhere he actually wanted to go. His foundation donated hundreds of millions to various causes: education, healthcare, environmental conservation, but even his philanthropy felt mechanical, another obligation to be managed rather than a source of genuine satisfaction. He signed checks and attended galas, made speeches about social responsibility and corporate citizenship, but felt no real connection to the impact his money might be having. "What do you want?" Dr. Chen had asked during their most recent session. "Not what you think you should want, not what would be good for business, but what would actually make you happy." Atlas had sat in silence for several minutes, genuinely trying to access some authentic desire beneath the layers of strategic thinking and calculated decision-making that had become his default mode of existence. The question should have been simple, but it felt like trying to remember a foreign language he had once spoken fluently but hadn't used in years. "I don't know," he had finally admitted, the words feeling strange and vulnerable in his mouth. "I honestly don't know anymore." That admission had followed him home, echoing in the silence of his penthouse, bouncing off the walls of his perfectly curated life. He was 45 years old, worth billions of dollars, and had no idea what would actually bring him joy. The city glittered below him, millions of people pursuing their own versions of success and happiness, while he remained suspended above it all like a satellite, observing, analyzing, but never truly participating. He had achieved everything he had thought he wanted, and discovered that the achievement itself was hollow, without someone to share it with, without connections that mattered more than contracts. His phone buzzed with another congratulatory message, this one from a business rival who probably hoped Atlas would die tomorrow, but felt obligated to acknowledge his latest triumph. The performative nature of his relationships had become so normalized that he barely noticed it anymore. But tonight it struck him as profoundly sad. Somewhere out there, Atlas was certain, were people who loved genuinely, who built lives around connection rather than accumulation, who woke up excited about their days rather than merely obligated to get through them. He had chosen a different path, had prioritized achievement over authenticity, and was now discovering that success without meaning was perhaps the cruelest fate of all. The whiskey burned pleasantly in his throat, but it couldn't warm the cold space in his chest where something essential seemed to be missing. He raised his glass to the city below, a solitary toast to a victory that felt more like defeat. To having everything, he whispered to his empty penthouse, and understanding nothing. The dreams would come again tonight, he knew, carrying him back to a version of himself that had once been capable of feeling things deeply, of making promises he had meant to keep, of touching something real in a world that had since become artificial in every meaningful way. But for now, he was Atlas Meridian, billionaire, visionary, success story, and the loneliest man in a city of 8 million souls. Chapter 6. When Lightning Strikes Twice. Fate has a peculiar sense of justice. It waits 20 years to collect its debts, then strikes with the precision of divine retribution. The heart attack hit Atlas Meridian with the sudden violence of a lightning strike, tearing through his chest as he stood at the head of the boardroom table, mid-sentence in a presentation that would have added another 100 million to his already obscene wealth. One moment, he was explaining market penetration strategies to a room full of executives. The next, he was collapsing onto the polished mahogany surface, his perfectly pressed shirt soaked with sweat, his breath coming in desperate gasps that sounded like prayers to a god he had forgotten how to address. "Call 911!" someone shouted, but the voice seemed to come from very far away, muffled by the roar of blood in his ears and the crushing weight that had settled on his chest like the hand of judgment itself. The faces around the table blurred into abstract shapes, expensive suits and worried expressions melting together as his vision narrowed to a tunnel of fading light. In those moments between consciousness and darkness, Atlas's mind didn't flash to his achievements or his wealth or the empire he had built from ambition and ruthless determination. Instead, he found himself thinking of storms and mountain cabins, of promises made in passion and broken in cowardice. The irony wasn't lost on him, even as his heart literally failed. It was still trying to lead him back to the one place where it had ever truly been alive. The ambulance ride passed in a haze of sirens and urgent voices, paramedics working over his body with professional efficiency while he drifted between awareness and oblivion. Somewhere in the distance he could hear them radioing ahead to the hospital, using medical terminology that sounded like a foreign language, but conveyed urgency that even his failing consciousness could understand. Massive myocardial infarction in a 45-year-old male. Blood pressure dropping. Prep the cardiac unit. ETA 6 minutes. Seattle General Hospital received him like a broken machine delivered for emergency repair, wheeling him through corridors that smelled of antiseptic and human suffering, past rooms full of other people fighting their own battles with mortality. The cardiac unit erupted into controlled chaos as medical professionals materialized from every direction, their movements choreographed by years of training and the desperate urgency of a life hanging in the balance. Medical student Lyra Ashanti was completing her rounds when the code blue alarm shattered the evening quiet, its electronic shriek cutting through the hospital like a call to war. As a fourth-year student on her surgical rotation, she was still adjusting to the adrenaline rush that came with emergency medicine, still learning to channel her natural intensity into the focused calm that critical situations demanded. She ran toward the cardiac unit with the other responding medical staff, her grey eyes already shifting into the analytical mode that had carried her through 4 years of medical training. This was what she had prepared for, the moment when all her studying and sacrifice would translate into the simple, essential act of saving a human life. The patient on the gurney was a man in his mid-40s, well-dressed despite his medical crisis, with the kind of presence that suggested wealth and authority even in unconsciousness. His dark hair was streaked with silver at the temples, and his face bore the lines of someone accustomed to stress and responsibility. But what struck Lyra most forcefully was the expression of profound peace that had settled over his features, as though the heart attack had somehow freed him from burdens he had carried for too long. "What do we have?" Dr. Williams, the attending physician, demanded as they transferred Atlas to the cardiac table. "Massive MI, anterior wall involvement, ST elevation in leads V2, V3 and V4, the paramedic reported, rattling off vital signs that painted a picture of a heart in full revolt against the body it was supposed to sustain. Lyra took her position in the medical team with the quiet confidence that had characterized her performance throughout medical school. She had steady hands, a sharp mind, and the kind of intuitive understanding of human physiology that couldn't be taught in textbooks. As they worked to stabilize their patient, she found herself studying his face, noting something familiar in the bone structure that she couldn't quite identify. The surgery lasted 6 grueling hours, a delicate dance between medical science and desperate hope. Atlas's heart had sustained massive damage, requiring multiple interventions and a level of surgical skill that pushed everyone in the operating room to their limits. Through it all, Lyra remained focused and steady, anticipating needs before they arose, providing assistance with the kind of natural timing that marked her as someone destined for surgical excellence. "He's lucky," Dr. Williams muttered as they finally stepped back from the table. Their patient stabilized but still critical. Another few minutes and we would have been performing an autopsy instead of surgery. As the primary surgical team dispersed to write reports and grab desperately needed coffee, Lyra remained behind to monitor their patient's immediate post-operative condition. It was a routine responsibility, but she found herself inexplicably drawn to this particular case, studying the man's face with curiosity that went beyond professional interest. There was something about his features that seemed familiar, though she was certain they had never met. Perhaps it was the aristocratic line of his nose, or the stubborn set of his jaw, even in unconsciousness, or the way his silver-streaked hair caught the harsh fluorescent light. Whatever it was, it triggered a sense of recognition that she couldn't explain or dismiss. It was then that she noticed her own reflection in the darkened window beside his bed, and the comparison hit her with startling force. The shape of their faces was remarkably similar, the bone structure nearly identical despite the differences in age and gender. Even more striking was the way the light fell across his neck, revealing what appeared to be a faint, crescent-shaped mark just below his collar line. Lyra's hand moved instinctively to her own neck, to the birthmark that had been her constant companion since birth. The mark, her mother had always claimed, was proof of her special destiny. The similarity couldn't be coincidental. The shape was too distinctive, too unusual to appear randomly in two unrelated people. Her heart began to race with implications she wasn't ready to fully consider. This man was the right age, roughly 20 years older than herself. He was white, well-educated, successful, all attributes that matched the sparse details her mother had shared about her father. And now there was this mark, this physical evidence of a connection that seemed too significant to be mere chance. "Impossible," she whispered to herself, but even as she spoke the word, she could feel the truth of it settling in her chest like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples of recognition through her entire understanding of herself and her history. Atlas stirred on the bed, his eyelids fluttering as consciousness began to return. Lyra moved closer, professional duty overriding her personal shock, checking his vital signs and monitoring his emergence from the anesthesia. His eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then gradually sharpening as awareness returned. When his gaze finally fixed on her face, something extraordinary happened. She watched his expression change from confusion to recognition to something that looked almost like terror. His eyes moved from her face to her neck, to the crescent-shaped birthmark that she had never bothered to conceal, and she saw him go rigid with what could only be described as shocked understanding. "No," he breathed, the word barely audible, but carrying the weight of 20 years of denial and desperate hope. "It can't be." Their eyes met across the narrow space between them, grey staring into grey. Two people separated by decades and circumstances, but connected by something deeper than either had been prepared to acknowledge. In that moment, the careful barriers that Lyra had built around her curiosity about her father crumbled completely, and she found herself face to face with the man whose absence had shaped her entire life. "Your name," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening in her chest. "What's your name?" "Atlas," he whispered, and she heard 20 years of guilt and longing compressed into those two syllables. Atlas Meridian. The name meant nothing to her consciously, but something in her DNA seemed to recognize it, seemed to vibrate with the rightness of finally having an identity to attach to half her genetic inheritance. This was her father, not the idealized figure she had sometimes imagined, not the monster her mother's silence had sometimes suggested, but a flawed, broken, successful, and ultimately human man who was staring at her as though she were a ghost materialized from his deepest regrets. "You know who I am," Lyra said. It wasn't a question. Atlas nodded, tears streaming down his face with surprising intensity. "Lyra," he said, and hearing her name in his voice was like listening to an echo from a dream she had never remembered having. "You're Lyra." The confirmation hit her like a physical blow, forcing her to sit down in the chair beside his bed. All her life she had wondered about this moment, had constructed elaborate fantasies about meeting her father, about the explanations he might offer, and the relationship they might build. But she had never imagined it would happen like this, with him broken and vulnerable, with her holding his life in her medically trained hands. "I saved you," she said, the irony of the situation settling over her like a blanket of snow. "I saved your life." "Yes," Atlas replied, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You saved me, just like your mother did 20 years ago." The mention of her mother sent another shockwave through Lyra's system. "You remember her?" "Every day," he admitted. "Every night. I dream about her, about the cabin, about the promise I made and broke. I dream about the life I walked away from." They stared at each other in silence, father and daughter meeting for the first time as adults, both struggling to process the magnitude of what fate had orchestrated. Here was the man whose DNA she carried, whose absence had motivated her to excel, whose abandonment had forged the steel in her mother's spine that had shaped them both into the formidable people they had become. "Why didn't you come back?" The question escaped her lips before she could consider whether she was ready to hear the answer. Atlas closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they held 20 years of carefully buried pain. "Because I was a coward," he said simply. "Because I chose the easy path over the right path. Because I was 25 years old and thought I had forever to make things right." The honesty of his admission surprised her. She had expected excuses, justifications, elaborate explanations that would shift blame or minimize responsibility. Instead, he offered her the simple truth. He had been weak when strength was required, selfish when sacrifice was necessary, cowardly when courage was the only acceptable response. "She never spoke about you," Lyra said. "Not your name, not your story, not what happened between you. I grew up knowing I had a father, but not knowing anything else." "She protected you from my failures," Atlas replied. "She gave you something I never could have, a life built on strength instead of weakness, on presence instead of absence." As they talked through the night, with Lyra officially monitoring his post-operative recovery, but really trying to understand the complex mathematics of how half her identity had finally revealed itself. Both began to grasp the cruel poetry of their situation. She had saved his life, using skills developed through a determination forged by his abandonment. He had been rescued by the daughter whose existence he had spent 20 years trying to forget. "What happens now?" Lyra asked, as dawn began to filter through the hospital windows. Atlas looked at her with eyes that held more hope than he had felt in 2 decades. "That depends on you," he said, "and on whether your mother can ever forgive me for taking 20 years to become the man I should have been from the beginning." Fate, it seemed, had a long memory and an even longer reach. The storm that had brought them together 20 years ago had finally come full circle, delivering consequences that neither had seen coming, but both had somehow been preparing for their entire lives. Chapter 7. The Mark of Truth. Truth has a way of surfacing when you least expect it, wearing the face of coincidence, but carrying the weight of destiny. Atlas Meridian's private investigators were the best money could buy. Discreet, thorough, and capable of unearthing information that most people assumed was buried forever. Within 48 hours of his discharge from Seattle General Hospital, he had a complete dossier on Dr. Lyra Ashanti spread across his penthouse desk like pieces of a puzzle he was both desperate and terrified to solve. The photographs were what undid him completely. Professional headshots from medical journals showed a young woman who possessed his bone structure, wrapped in her mother's elegant beauty. But it was the candid shots that stopped his breath. Lyra laughing with fellow residents, her head thrown back in joy that reminded him of rain-soaked mornings in a mountain cabin. Lyra, in her white coat, serious and focused, with the same intense concentration he saw in his own mirror during high-stakes negotiations. Lyra at her medical school graduation, standing beside a woman who was unmistakably Kira Ashanti, older, more refined, but still achingly beautiful after 20 years. Lyra Marie Ashanti. He read aloud from the investigative report, his voice hoarse with emotion. Born March 15, 2006, Montana General Hospital. Mother, Dr. Kira Ashanti, father unknown. Currently enrolled as 4th-year medical student at Stanford University School of Medicine, youngest student in program history, entered at age 16. The dates aligned perfectly with his guilty memory. 9 months after the storm that had changed his life, after 3 days of passion that had felt like glimpsing paradise, after promises he had made with complete sincerity and broken with inexcusable cowardice. He studied every detail of his daughter's accomplishments with the hungry fascination of a man discovering he had somehow contributed to creating magnificence. Valedictorian of her high school class at 16. Undergraduate degree completed in 3 years with highest honors. Medical school acceptance to Harvard, Stanford, and Johns Hopkins, though she had chosen a state school to remain closer to her mother. First-year residency performance that had already earned her recognition from attending physicians twice her age. But it was the personal details that brought tears he hadn't shed in decades. Lyra volunteered at free clinics in underserved communities. She had started a scholarship fund for first-generation college students. She spoke 3 languages and played piano at a concert level. Every accomplishment was a testament to the woman who had raised her. But Atlas couldn't help wondering which traits might have come from him. The crescent-shaped birthmark was mentioned in her medical records, noted as a distinguishing characteristic during her pediatric care. Atlas touched the matching mark on his own neck, a genetic anomaly that had appeared in his family line for generations, according to his grandmother's stories. His great-grandfather had borne the same mark, as had several cousins scattered across the country. It was definitive proof of paternity, more reliable than any blood test. The report on Kira was equally comprehensive and infinitely more painful to read. Dr. Kira Ashanti had become exactly the doctor she had dreamed of becoming in that mountain cabin 20 years ago. But the path had been brutal in ways Atlas couldn't fully comprehend. Single motherhood through medical school, financial struggles that had forced her to work multiple jobs while maintaining a perfect GPA, social isolation from peers who couldn't understand her circumstances. Yet she had not just survived, she had triumphed spectacularly. Her clinic in Montana was now a regional medical center that served 3 counties. She was published in major medical journals, consulted on health policy at the state level, and revered by her community as someone who had transformed personal hardship into public service. She built a kingdom, Atlas whispered, remembering Lyra's words about queens not needing kings. Kira had indeed built something magnificent from the wreckage of his abandonment, had taken his betrayal and transformed it into strength that had shaped not just her own life, but the life of their extraordinary daughter. The guilt was overwhelming, but it was accompanied by something else, pride. He was proud of what his genetic contribution had helped create, proud of the woman who had made it possible, proud to be connected, however tenuously, to people who represented the very best of human potential, but pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not yet, not until he had faced the consequences of his choices, looked into Kira's eyes, and accepted whatever judgment she deemed appropriate for 20 years of absence. The decision to go to Montana wasn't difficult. It was inevitable. He had been running from this confrontation for 2 decades, and his heart attack had been a wake-up call delivered with the subtlety of divine intervention. He was 45 years old, wealthy beyond measure, and utterly empty inside. The only chance for redemption lay in the mountains where his story had begun. His charter flight touched down at the small airport outside Billings on a crisp October morning. The kind of day when the air was so clear it seemed to magnify every detail of the landscape. The mountains rose around him like cathedral spires, unchanged since his last visit, but somehow more beautiful than he remembered, as though seeing them through the lens of regret and hope had sharpened their majesty. The drive to Kira's clinic took him through country that was both familiar and foreign. Landscapes that had haunted his dreams without his conscious mind recognizing their source. Every mile brought him closer to a reckoning he had spent 20 years avoiding. Closer to the moment when he would have to look into the eyes of the woman he had wronged and accept the consequences of his cowardice. The Mountain View Medical Center was nothing like the small clinic he remembered from his investigative reports. The building was modern and substantial, clearly built to serve a much larger population than the original facility. The parking lot was full of vehicles from across the region, testament to the reputation Dr. Kira Ashanti had built through 2 decades of dedicated service. Atlas sat in his rental car for nearly an hour, gathering courage for a conversation that would determine whether the rest of his life held any possibility of meaning beyond the accumulation of wealth. He had conquered boardrooms full of hostile executives, had negotiated billion-dollar deals under crushing pressure, had built an empire through sheer force of will. But walking into this clinic to face a woman he had wronged required more courage than any business venture had ever demanded. The receptionist was polite but clearly curious about this well-dressed stranger who had requested to see Dr. Ashanti without an appointment. "I'm sorry, but Dr. Ashanti is fully booked today. If this is a medical emergency, tell her Atlas is here," he said quietly. "She'll see me." Something in his tone must have convinced her, because she made the call despite her obvious reluctance. Atlas watched her expression change as she spoke to someone on the other end, saw the moment when his name registered with whoever had answered. "Dr. Ashanti will see you," the receptionist said, her voice carefully professional, despite the curiosity burning in her eyes. "Please follow me." The walk down the corridor felt like a march to judgment, each step bringing him closer to the moment of truth he had spent 20 years avoiding. Medical staff moved around him with purposeful efficiency, dedicated to the same calling that had motivated Kira since her teenage years, now serving the vision she had built from determination and necessity. Dr. Ashanti's office door was heavy oak with her name engraved on a brass nameplate that seemed to shine with well-earned authority. Atlas paused before it, his hand raised to knock, suddenly paralyzed by the magnitude of what lay beyond that barrier. "Come in," came a voice that was achingly familiar despite the decades that had passed. "The door is open." He turned the handle and stepped into the presence of the woman he had loved and abandoned. The woman who had borne his child and built a life of meaning from the ashes of his betrayal, Dr. Kira. Ashanti sat behind her desk with the poise of someone who had faced impossible challenges and emerged victorious. Her beauty enhanced rather than diminished by the years and experiences that had shaped her into the formidable woman she had become. Their eyes met across the space that separated them. 20 years of silence and longing compressed into a single moment of recognition. She was 39 now, her face bearing the lines of someone who had smiled through pain and found strength in struggle. Her hair was shorter, her clothing more professional, but her eyes were exactly as he remembered. Intelligent, fierce, capable of seeing through pretense to the truth beneath. "Hello." "Kira," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Atlas," she replied, his name carrying the weight of judgment and the promise of reckoning. They stared at each other in silence. The woman who had refused to break, and the man who had finally come home to face the consequences of his weakness, both understanding that everything that happened next would determine whether redemption was possible or if some betrayals run too deep for forgiveness. "You look exactly the same," Atlas said, the inadequate words falling between them like stones in still water. "I look like someone who raised your daughter alone," Kira replied, her voice steady as a surgical scalpel. "I look like someone who built a life from the wreckage you left behind," and in that response, Atlas heard the first note of the symphony of judgment that would determine the rest of his life. Chapter 8, The Hunt for Forgiveness. Some hunts are for prey that fights back, others are for mercy that may never come. No matter how desperately you pursue it, Atlas Meridian had conquered nations of commerce and brought titans of industry to their knees. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for the surgical precision of Dr. Kira Ashanti's controlled fury. She sat behind her desk like a judge delivered sentence, her posture erect and unforgiving, her eyes holding 20 years of carefully banked rage that burned steady and cold as winter stars. "You want to know about your daughter?" Kira's voice cut through the silence of her office with the efficiency of a scalpel, each word chosen for maximum impact. "She worked 3 jobs to pay for college textbooks because she was too proud to let me sacrifice any more for her education. She watched me cry exactly once, the night she was born, when I realized that you were never coming back, that I was going to raise this perfect child without any help from the man who promised me forever." Atlas opened his mouth to speak, but she raised her hand with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, someone who had learned to command respect through competence rather than inherited privilege. "She asked about you exactly 7 times throughout her childhood," Kira continued, her tone remaining clinically professional despite the emotional devastation she was delivering. 7 times she wanted to know why other children had fathers and she had only stories. Do you know what I told her? Kira, I told her that some men are builders and some men are destroyers, and that she was better off with the memory of someone who might have been good rather than the reality of someone who chose to be weak. Kira leaned forward in her chair, her gaze never wavering from his face. "I told her that queens don't need kings to build kingdoms, and that she was born to be royalty." The words hit Atlas like physical blows, each one landing with the precision of someone who had spent 20 years perfecting the art of surviving without him. He had expected anger, had prepared himself for recriminations and accusations, but this clinical dissection of his failures was somehow worse than screaming would have been. "She graduated first in her medical school class," Kira said, her voice taking on the pride that had sustained her through 2 decades of single parenthood. She started a scholarship fund for students from broken homes. She volunteers at free clinics and speaks 3 languages and plays piano like an angel. Her smile was sharp as broken glass. All of that brilliance, all of that compassion, all of that strength she got from watching me refuse to let your abandonment define our future. Atlas felt each accomplishment like a knife twisted in his chest. Not because he wasn't proud of his daughter's achievements, but because he had contributed nothing to the woman who had made them possible. He was a genetic footnote in a story of triumph written entirely by someone else's sacrifice and determination. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling pathetically inadequate even as he spoke them. Kira laughed. And the sound could have frozen fire. "Sorry?" She rose from her chair and moved around the desk until she stood directly in front of him, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of the lavender soap she had always favored. "Sorry is what you say when you're 5 minutes late to a dinner reservation. You were 20 years late to your daughter's life." She stepped even closer, and Atlas saw that the years had transformed her into someone magnificent and terrible, someone who had taken his betrayal and forged it into armor that made her untouchable. "That girl saved your worthless life 3 days ago," Kira said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "She spent 6 hours fighting to repair the heart that couldn't be bothered to remember her existence. How's that for cosmic irony?" The weight of it crushed him. His daughter, the child he had never known, had literally held his life in her skilled hands and chosen to save him despite having every reason to let him die. The poetry of divine justice was too perfect to be accidental, too precisely orchestrated to be mere coincidence. "I want to make this right," Atlas said, his voice breaking with 20 years of suppressed guilt and desperate hope. "Right?" Kira's laugh was like breaking glass, beautiful and dangerous simultaneously. "There is no right, Atlas. There is no formula for making up for 20 years of absence. There is no mathematical equation that can balance the scales of what you took from us." She walked to the window that looked out over the medical complex she had built from determination and necessity, her reflection superimposed over the mountains where their story had begun. "I made something from nothing," she said, her voice carrying the quiet pride of someone who had faced impossible odds and refused to surrender. "I took your abandonment and turned it into strength. I took your cowardice and used it to teach our daughter that she never had to depend on anyone else for her worth." "Our daughter," Atlas repeated, testing the words that felt foreign in his mouth. "My daughter," Kira corrected with surgical precision. "You were a sperm donor who got lucky. I was the one who held her when she was sick, who helped her with homework, who taught her to be strong when the world tried to make her feel less than. You don't get to claim parental ownership after 2 decades of voluntary absence." The truth of her words was undeniable, but it was the pain behind them that gutted him most completely. He could see now what his abandonment had cost, not just the obvious struggles of single parenthood, but the deeper wound of being made to feel disposable by someone who had claimed to love her. "I dream about you," he admitted, the confession torn from him by desperation. "Every night for 20 years, I dream about the cabin and the storm and the promises I made. I dream about the life we could have built together." "Dreams," Kira said, turning back to face him with eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of 2 decades of rebuilding herself from rubble. "Dreams are luxury items, Atlas. I couldn't afford them when I had a baby to raise and a career to build. I couldn't indulge in fantasies about what might have been when I was working double shifts to pay for medical school while pregnant." She moved back to her desk and picked up a framed photograph. Lyra at her medical school graduation, radiant with accomplishment and joy, standing beside the woman who had made it all possible through sheer force of will. "This is what I built instead of dreams," Kira said, holding the photograph like evidence in a trial. This is the reality I created from the wreckage you left behind. Atlas stared at the image of his daughter, their daughter, and felt the full weight of what he had missed, what his cowardice had cost him. Birthdays and Christmas mornings, scraped knees and teenage heartbreaks, proud moments and difficult conversations, the thousand small interactions that build the foundation of love between parent and child. "Let me try to earn her forgiveness," he said, his voice breaking with emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades. "Let me try to become someone worthy of the woman you raised." "Her forgiveness isn't mine to give or withhold," Kira replied. "And she's not a woman I raised. She's a woman who raised herself while watching me prove that strength comes from standing up every time life knocks you down." The silence stretched between them, heavy with 20 years of unspoken words and unhealed wounds. Atlas found himself studying her face, noting the lines that spoke of laughter as well as struggle, the confidence that came from surviving the unsurvivable and emerging stronger than before. "What would it take?" he asked finally. "What would I need to do to earn the right to know her, to be part of her life in whatever way she'll allow?" Kira was quiet for so long that Atlas thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of carefully considered judgment. "You would need to prove that you understand the difference between wanting something and deserving it," she said. "You would need to demonstrate that you're capable of putting someone else's needs before your own convenience. You would need to show that you've learned the difference between promises made in passion and commitments honored through sacrifice." She leaned back in her chair, studying him with the clinical detachment of a doctor examining a particularly complex case. "Most importantly," she continued, you would need to convince her that you're not just here because you're dying and suddenly feeling nostalgic about the roads not taken. She deserves better than being someone's deathbed revelation." The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to cut deeply. His heart attack had indeed triggered this reckoning, had forced him to confront the emptiness of his existence and search for meaning in connections he had abandoned. But it was also more complex than that, a awakening to the reality that success without love was just elaborate failure, that all his achievements meant nothing if they couldn't be shared with people who mattered. "I know I have no right to ask for anything," Atlas said, his voice steady despite the earthquake happening in his chest. "I know that showing up after 20 years of silence is the height of arrogance, but I also know that she saved my life, and that can't be coincidence. The universe doesn't arrange that kind of poetry without meaning. The universe," Kira said with devastating quiet, "arranged for your daughter to develop the skills necessary to save your life because I raised her to be a healer in a world full of people like you, people who take what they need and disappear when responsibility calls." She stood again, signaling that their conversation was approaching its end. "If you want to know Lyra, you'll have to convince her that you're worth knowing. And I can promise you this, she has her mother's judgment and her father's stubborn streak. She won't be easily impressed by wealth or power or carefully crafted apologies." Atlas rose as well, understanding that he was being dismissed, but also that he had been given something precious, not forgiveness, but possibility, a chance to prove that he had finally learned the difference between what he wanted and what he deserved. "Thank you," he said, moving toward the door, "for raising her to be extraordinary, for building something beautiful from my failure, for being everything I should have been and wasn't." "Don't thank me yet," Kira replied, her voice carrying a warning wrapped in steel. "Thank me if you manage to earn her respect without breaking her heart. Thank me if you prove worthy of the gift you never appreciated. Thank me if you can love her the way she deserves to be loved, completely, unconditionally, and without expecting anything in return." As Atlas left her office, he carried with him the weight of judgment and the burden of possibility. The hunt for forgiveness had begun, but he was beginning to understand that the prey he sought might be more elusive than any quarry he had ever pursued in the corporate world. Redemption, he was learning, was not something that could be bought or negotiated or conquered through force of will. It had to be earned through patient demonstration of worth, through consistent proof of transformation, through the slow and difficult process of becoming someone worthy of the love he had so carelessly discarded 20 years ago. Chapter 9. The Reckoning. When the past finally catches up with the present, mercy is not guaranteed, only the truth, delivered with the weight of accumulated justice. Lyra, Ashanti learned the complete truth about her parentage in the most brutal way possible, by overhearing the heated conversation between her mother and the man who had just been revealed as her biological father. She had come to the clinic to discuss a complex case with her mother, had approached Dr. Ashanti's office with the easy confidence of someone who belonged there, only to hear voices raised in confrontation that made her freeze outside the partially open door. "You destroyed my youth, my dreams, my name." Her mother's voice carried the weight of 20 years of carefully controlled rage. "You built your empire on the foundation of my broken promises while I raised your daughter, to believe she was better off without you." The words hit Lyra like a physical blow, forcing her to grab the doorframe for support as the implications crashed over her consciousness. The man she had saved, the billionaire whose life she had held in her hands during that 6-hour surgery, was not just a patient. He was the ghost who had haunted her mother's carefully guarded silences, the missing piece of her identity that she had wondered about her entire life. Atlas's voice came through the door, broken and pleading. "I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness. I know that 20 years of absence can't be explained away by fear and cowardice. But she saved my life, Kira. Our daughter saved my life. That has to mean something." "It means," her mother replied with surgical precision, "that she has become everything you are not, compassionate, present, willing to fight for people even when they don't deserve it." Lyra pressed herself against the wall outside the office, her heart pounding with the rhythm of revelation and rage. Every assumption she had made about her origins was crumbling in real time, replaced by a reality more complex and painful than any story she had constructed in her imagination. She listened as her mother detailed the struggles of single parenthood, the financial hardships, the social judgment, the thousand small sacrifices that had been necessary to raise a child alone while pursuing one of the most demanding careers imaginable. Each revelation was like a knife twisted in her chest, not because she hadn't known about the struggles. She had lived them alongside her mother, but because she was finally understanding the human cost of her father's abandonment in full and brutal detail. "She asked about you exactly 7 times throughout her childhood," her mother was saying, her voice carrying the pain of someone who had been forced to explain the inexplicable to a curious child. 7 times she wanted to know why she was different, why she was the only child in her class, without a father's name on her emergency contact forms. The memory of those conversations came flooding back, her 5-year-old self asking innocent questions that had made her mother's face tighten with barely concealed pain. The careful explanations about how some families were different, how strength could come from having one parent who loved enough for 2, how being special sometimes meant being alone. "What did you tell her?" Atlas asked, his voice raw with emotions that Lyra had never heard from him during their brief medical interactions. "I told her that queens don't need kings to build kingdoms," her mother replied, and Lyra felt tears streaming down her face as she recognized the phrase that had become their family motto, the saying that had sustained them through every difficulty and challenge. The conversation continued inside the office, but Lyra could no longer process the words through the roar of blood in her ears and the crushing weight of finally understanding her place in this impossible story. She was not just Lyra Ashanti, brilliant medical student and accomplished young woman. She was the living consequence of a passionate mistake. The child whose existence had been carefully erased from her father's consciousness until medical crisis had forced an unwanted reunion. When the office door finally opened and Atlas emerged, Lyra was waiting in the hallway with the controlled fury of someone who had inherited her mother's strength and her father's stubborn determination. He stopped short when he saw her, his face cycling through expressions of shock, guilt, and something that might have been hope. "You heard," he said simply. "I heard," Lyra confirmed, her voice steady despite the emotional hurricane raging inside her chest. "I heard about the storm and the cabin and the promises you made before disappearing into your successful life." They stared at each other in the antiseptic hallway of the clinic, father and daughter meeting for the first time with full knowledge of what connected them. Atlas looked older somehow, diminished by the weight of truth finally spoken aloud. Lyra looked exactly like what she was, a young woman who had just discovered that her entire understanding of herself had been built on the foundation of someone else's carefully managed lie. "I'm sorry," Atlas said, the words carrying 20 years of suppressed guilt and desperate regret. "Sorry," Lyra repeated, testing the word as though it were a foreign concept. "You're sorry for abandoning my mother when she was 19 and pregnant? You're sorry for building a billion-dollar empire while she worked 3 jobs to put food on our table? You're sorry for 20 years of voluntary absence from the life of a child you helped create?" Each question hit Atlas like a physical blow, but he didn't flinch or look away. He stood there and absorbed the full weight of his daughter's justified rage, understanding that this was part of the price he would have to pay for the chance at redemption. "I'm sorry for all of that," he said quietly. "I'm sorry for being 25 years old and thinking I had forever to make things right. I'm sorry for choosing the easy path when courage was required. I'm sorry for being weak when you and your mother needed me to be strong." Lyra studied his face with the clinical detachment she had learned in medical school, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. What she saw instead was genuine anguish, the kind of profound regret that couldn't be manufactured or performed. "Do you know what saved your life during that surgery?" she asked, her voice taking on the professional tone she used when discussing complex medical cases. "Your skill," Atlas replied. "Your training and competence and—" "My determination," Lyra interrupted. "My absolute refusal to let anyone die on my watch, even someone I didn't know, even someone whose life might not seem worth saving. I fought for you because that's who my mother raised me to be, someone who fights for people even when they don't deserve it." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. She had saved the life of the man whose absence had defined her existence, had used skills developed through a determination forged by his abandonment to rescue him from the consequences of a lifestyle built on the foundation of their broken family. "I want to know her," Atlas said, his voice breaking with emotions he had spent decades suppressing. "I want to try to earn the right to be part of your lives in whatever way you'll allow." "Her?" Lyra's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Her name is Dr. Kira Ashanti, and she is the strongest person I have ever known. She didn't just raise me, she raised herself from the ashes of your betrayal and became someone extraordinary." She stepped closer, close enough that Atlas could see the storm-grey eyes he had passed down to her, eyes that now held the accumulated wisdom of watching her mother refuse to break under impossible pressure. "You want to know what she did when you disappeared," Lyra continued. "She finished medical school while pregnant. She graduated valedictorian while raising an infant. She built this entire medical complex from nothing while teaching me that strength comes from standing up every time life knocks you down." Atlas nodded, understanding that he was receiving a lesson in the mathematics of consequence, learning precisely what his abandonment had cost and what remarkable people had emerged from the wreckage he had left behind. "I don't want your money," Lyra said, her voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who had never doubted her own worth. "I don't want your name, or your connections, or your carefully orchestrated apologies." She paused, studying his face with the intensity of someone making a diagnosis that would determine a patient's prognosis. "But I'll make you a deal," she continued. "You want forgiveness? You want the right to know the woman who built a queen from your abandonment? Then prove you deserve it. Prove that you understand the difference between wanting something and being worthy of it." Atlas felt a spark of hope flickering in his chest, the first genuine optimism he had experienced in years. "What would I need to do?" "Spend the rest of your life trying to become someone worthy of her," Lyra said simply. "Not someone who shows up with grand gestures and expensive gifts, but someone who understands that love is measured in presence, not presence. Someone who knows that strength is demonstrated through consistency, not convenience." She turned to leave, then paused and looked back at him one final time. 20 years ago, you had the chance to love the most extraordinary woman in the world, she said. You chose your ambition instead. Now you have the chance to try to earn back what you threw away. The question is whether you're finally man enough to fight for something that matters more than money. As Lyra walked away, Atlas understood that his journey toward redemption was just beginning. He had been given something precious, not forgiveness, but possibility. The chance to prove that he had finally learned what mattered, that he could become someone worthy of the love he had so carelessly discarded. The reckoning had begun, and Atlas Meridian, billionaire, visionary, success story, was about to discover whether he possessed the most difficult currency of all, the courage to change everything about himself for the chance to earn back what he had never deserved in the first place. Chapter 10. The price of a redemption. Redemption is not a destination, it is a lifetime sentence, served in the court of those you have wronged, where mercy is earned one day at a time. 3 months after the confrontation that changed everything, Atlas Meridian sat in the small coffee shop across from the Mountain View Medical Center, watching through rain-streaked windows as Dr. Kira Ashanti arrived for another day of healing the world he had helped break. She moved with the confident efficiency that had attracted him 20 years ago, but now carried the additional weight of authority earned through 2 decades of proving herself indispensable to her community. He had been making this pilgrimage every week since their devastating encounter, not to stalk or pressure, but to understand, to observe from a respectful distance the life she had built, the people she had helped, the kingdom she had constructed from the ashes of his abandonment. Each visit was a lesson in the mathematics of consequence, a masterclass in what it meant to transform personal devastation into public service. The townspeople had begun to notice the well-dressed stranger who appeared regularly but never approached the clinic, never caused trouble, simply sat and watched with the intensity of someone studying a particularly complex problem. Some recognized him from business magazines, others simply noted his expensive clothes and obvious wealth. But all could see that he was somehow connected to their beloved Dr. Ashanti, and they watched him with the protective wariness of people guarding something precious. Lyra had returned to Seattle to complete her final medical school rotations and begin her residency search. But she called her mother every evening at exactly 7 p.m., their voices carrying through the thin walls of the boarding house where Atlas had taken a simple room rather than impose his wealth on a community that had no need of his money. He could hear fragments of their conversations, discussions of complex medical cases, updates on Lyra's progress, the comfortable intimacy of 2 people who had weathered every storm together. On this particular rainy Tuesday, Atlas's vigil was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. The bell above the coffee shop door chimed, and Dr. Kira Ashanti herself entered. shaking droplets from her umbrella with the unconscious grace that had haunted his dreams for 20 years. She approached his table with the measured steps of someone who had made a difficult decision and was committed to seeing it through. "May I sit?" Atlas nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. She settled across from him with the poise of a queen, granting audience to a supplicant, her medical coat pristine white against the casual setting of the small-town coffee shop. "You've been watching," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Learning," Atlas corrected. "Trying to understand what I walked away from, what you built in my absence." The waitress approached with coffee, treating Dr. Ashanti with the reverential familiarity reserved for local heroes. Kira accepted her cup with a smile that transformed her face into something radiant, and Atlas felt his heart constrict with recognition of the woman he had fallen in love with in a storm-swept cabin. "Mrs. Henderson's diabetes is under control," Kira said conversationally, stirring sugar into her coffee. "Tommy Martinez finished his physical therapy ahead of schedule. The Johnson baby was born healthy, despite complications that would have required emergency transport to Billings if we hadn't expanded our maternal care unit." Atlas listened to her recital of daily victories, understanding that she was giving him a glimpse into the life she had created, the meaning she had found in healing rather than accumulating. "Every life you've touched," he said quietly, "is a testament to the choice you made to stay and build rather than run and destroy." "Every life I've touched," Kira replied with the precision of a surgeon making a crucial incision, "is a testament to the choice I made to transform your abandonment into strength rather than bitterness." They sat in silence as rain drummed against the windows. 20 years of unspoken words stretching between them, like a chasm that might never be fully bridged. "Lyra told me about your conversation," Kira said finally. "About your proposal." "It wasn't a proposal," Atlas said. "It was a plea, a recognition that I have no right to ask for anything, but that I'm willing to spend whatever time I have left trying to earn the privilege of knowing the extraordinary people my weakness helped create." Kira studied his face with the clinical detachment of someone who had learned to read truth in the smallest expressions. "And what exactly would that look like? You returning to your empire every few months for brief visits? Sending expensive gifts to assuage your guilt? Playing the role of remorseful father when it's convenient?" "No," Atlas said, his voice carrying a certainty that surprised them both. "It would look like selling everything and moving here permanently. It would look like finding ways to serve this community that don't depend on my money or status. It would look like proving through consistent presence that I've finally learned the difference between success and significance." The words hung in the air between them, more binding than any contract Atlas had ever signed. He had made the decision during one of his sleepless nights in the boarding house, staring at the ceiling and finally understanding that redemption required sacrifice, that earning back what he had lost would cost him everything he had gained. "You would give up your empire?" Kira asked, skepticism evident in her voice. "My empire is empty," Atlas replied. "It's a monument to ambition without purpose, wealth without meaning. I built it on the foundation of abandoning the only things that ever mattered to me." He leaned forward, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that recalled stormy nights and passionate promises. "I can't undo 20 years of absence, Kira. I can't give you back your youth or your dreams or the nights you spent raising our daughter alone. But I can give you the rest of my life if you'll let me try to become someone worthy of the woman you've become." Kira was quiet for so long that Atlas wondered if she had dismissed him entirely, if even this gesture was too little, too late. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of carefully considered judgment. "Lyra thinks you might be worth saving," she said. "She's developed a theory that people can change if the motivation is strong enough, if the consequences of not changing are unacceptable." "And what do you think?" Atlas asked. A smile played at the corners of Kira's mouth, the first genuine warmth she had shown him since his return. I think, she said slowly, that I've spent 20 years proving that people can transform themselves through determination and purpose. It would be hypocritical of me to believe that transformation is only possible for abandoned mothers, and not for the men who abandon them. Hope bloomed in Atlas's chest like a flower in desert soil, fragile but undeniably alive. Does that mean— It means, Kira interrupted, that you can try. It means you can attempt to earn back what you threw away, to become someone worthy of the love you so carelessly discarded. But understand this, I'm not the 19-year-old girl who believed in forever. I'm a woman who has learned that actions matter more than words, that consistency matters more than passion, that presence matters more than promises. She stood to leave, then paused and looked back at him with eyes that held both challenge and possibility. If you're truly committed to this path, she said, then start by proving it to the community that saved me when you couldn't be bothered to stay. Prove it to the people who watched me struggle and supported me anyway. Prove that you understand the difference between charity and service, between penance and genuine transformation. As she walked away, Atlas felt the weight of the task ahead, settling on his shoulders like a mantle of responsibility he had spent decades avoiding. He was 45 years old, worth billions of dollars, and about to embark on the most difficult acquisition of his career, earning back the love of the woman he had wronged and the respect of the daughter he had never known. But for the first time in 20 years, he felt genuinely alive. The empty success that had defined his existence was about to be replaced by something infinitely more challenging and meaningful. The slow, difficult work of becoming someone worthy of redemption. Through the coffee shop window, he watched Kira disappear into her clinic, ready to heal whatever wounds the day might bring. And Atlas Meridian, no longer just a billionaire, but a man with a purpose worth pursuing, began to plan the rest of his life around earning back what mattered most. Redemption would not come easily or quickly. It would require every skill he had ever developed, every lesson he had ever learned, every ounce of determination he possessed. But for the first time since that stormy night in a mountain cabin, Atlas understood what he was truly fighting for. The price of redemption was everything he had built for himself, paid in service to everyone he had failed. And finally, at long last, he was ready to pay it.